Hey everyone, this is Randall and welcome to a special topics video that I've been thinking about putting together now for a few weeks. Recently, the long anticipated reboot of Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer the Old World, was released to the public. There's been a massive amount of excitement in the lead up to the game's release, and the release itself has been met with all the familiar hallmarks of a big Games Workshop product line release, including stock outages, fear of the future support drying up, disappointment about statements made by GW, pricing complaints, all the usual stuff. But with this renewed interest in the rank and file, rank and flank style of game that the Old World is presenting, I felt I'd be remiss if I did not put together a quick video showcasing my own rank and flank game of choice and present it to those who might be interested in Warhammer the Old World, but who may have some reservations about either getting into the game or sticking with the game. There are a number of other popular rank and flank games out there that, while not as huge in market presence as anything GW puts out, they offer their own unique take on the genre. Some of these include Conquest: The Last Argument of Kings, Kings of War, and my favorite game and the subject of this video, A Song of Ice and Fire, the Tabletop Miniatures Game. I hope that the YouTube algorithm will pick up this video and fling it out into space where, like the Pioneer 10 and 11 spacecrafts of the 1970s, it will hopefully pass into the feeds of players who may be unaware of the existence of A Song of Ice and Fire, or who may know about the game but never really thought about it as an alternative to Warhammer the Old World. Now, while I will be mentioning some favorable points of comparison between the Old World and A Song of Ice and Fire, this video is not intended at all to be a critical review or condemnation of the Old World or of Games Workshop, and certainly not of the fans of either. The intention of this video is to evangelize the game I love, A Song of Ice and Fire, the Tabletop Miniatures Game, and hopefully build awareness among fellow rank and flank fans who may have never heard of it, or who may have heard of it but never given it much thought. We're all after the same thing here, enjoying the hobby that we love together, and helping to grow that hobby through community building with a spirit of openness and sharing. So without further ado, let's look at the top 10 reasons why Warhammer the Old World players should consider playing A Song of Ice and Fire, the Miniatures Game. Reason number 1, list building complexity. As with almost any GW wargame, list building can be a daunting task. In the Old World, this hasn't changed much, and perhaps has even become a little bit more complex. In the Old World, your army building points are divided among various categories, each with its own allowance. So there are character units, core units, special units, rare units, and allied units. Once you've selected your actual unit, for the sake of example, let's take a Bretonnian Duke from the character units list. That Duke will need some special customization before he's ready for the battlefield. He's going to need a weapon selected for him, and then an armor selection, and then he might want a shield, and no self-respecting Bretonnian Duke will want to walk into combat, so he's going to want to pick from one of the 5 mount options. And then let's not forget about magic items or knightly vows he can take. So depending on the army size you pick, you're going to be doing a good bit of granular mathematics to build up your 500 to 2,000 point army. In A Song of Ice and Fire, the standard army size is just 40 points. Most people can do math in their heads up to 40, so doing list building on the fly in your head is pretty achievable with this game. The first step of army building after picking a faction is picking your commander. That commander will always be a familiar or sometimes obscure character directly from A Song of Ice and Fire lore, like a Tywin Lannister, Ned Stark, or someone less well known like Skahaz Mo Kandak from the Targaryen faction. No matter who you pick as your commander though, there are no additional customization options you need to pick. Your commander's miniature gets dropped into a combat unit of your choice, and that commander's attachment card gets attached to that combat unit. So while Skahaz won't have 15 different wargear choices before he joins his unit of Unsullied Swordmasters, he will provide that unit with a set of abilities from his attachment card that will potentially make that unit much more powerful in the game. The same goes for other non-commander unit attachments. There's typically only one attachment possible per unit, but they can provide a ton of various abilities that allow the player to cater an army to their particular playstyle or goal. Want an army that has tons of negative morale modifiers so you can cause extra panic wounds to your enemy? Go ahead and drop in some attachments that will help with that. Want to facilitate a hit and run playstyle with your list? Select some highly mobile combat units and unit attachments that complement this playstyle. Reason number 2, unit trays. Warhammer the Old World has a seemingly endless variety of unit tray sizes depending on how the player wants to construct their individual units. You want a fairly typical infantry block of 20 skeletons and 4 ranks of 5? Great. Want a single long rank of skeletons for meta reasons? Okay, sure. But that kind of variety may appeal to some players, but it's going to make the construction of believable looking armies a bit more of a challenge, and it forces players to construct a handful of different unit trays to suit various formations. This adds to the cost, time, and effort required to keep an old world army current and competitive, especially since in most cases you're going to need to buy your unit trays either from GW or from a third-party seller. In A Song of Ice and Fire, there are 4 unit tray sizes. There's square-shaped ones for infantry, cavalry, and solo units, and a single rectangular-shaped one for war machines, chariots, and some monsters. You do not need to purchase these trays separately or construct them. They come along with the miniatures in each unit box, or in the case of the rectangular-based units, they are already attached to that unit. Reason number 3, a simpler rulebook. It's no surprise to anyone with even a passing knowledge of Games Workshop games that Warhammer games all require a bunch of different rulebooks, supplements, codices, etc. Warhammer the Old World has just launched, but if you want to play as one of the starting armies, Bretonnia or the Tomb Kings, you'll need to purchase the following books. First, the rulebook itself, which is free in one of the launch starters, and then either the Forces of Fantasy or Ravening Hordes book, depending on which of the starting factions you want to play. And then on top of that, you're going to need your Preferred Factions Arcane Journal. So that's 3 different tomes you'll need just to begin your first game. If you want to collect both of the starting factions, that's 5 separate books you need to buy, which weigh in at 592 pages for Bretonnia or 560 for Tomb Kings, or 800 pages total for the 2 factions together. By the time you're done buying these books, you've probably spent nearly as much money as the cost of one of the starter boxes. A Song of Ice and Fire, by contrast, includes its rulebook in each starter set, and it's also available free online, and weighs in at a whopping 36 pages. There's very little bloat in the rule set, and one could argue there's not enough in the rule set, as there are some rules and questions that have to be clarified in FAQ documents or community articles. But I digress. In A Song of Ice and Fire, you could foreseeably purchase a starter at your local game store, take off the shrink wrap right then and there, and walk yourself through your first game with the rulebook open right in front of you. This is nigh impossible with the Old World, which will require you to go home and study by candlelight with a stack of tomes on your desk like Gandalf before ever considering playing an actual game. Reason number 4, fewer barriers to entry. Warhammer the Old World, as with other Warhammer games, requires assembly and ideally the painting of its miniatures prior to playing the game. Assembly, though, is an absolute must, and as discussed earlier, the Old World adds the additional wrinkle of requiring construction of movement trays. While it doesn't take all that long to cut minis from a sprue and slap some glue on them, it's still something that will take the player at least a day or two to accomplish after purchase. And once they're done, they're still faced with a legion of familiar gray-colored plastic, potentially the same color as their opponent's gray plastic if they play games together prior to painting. Song of Ice and Fire, on the other hand, features pre-built miniatures that are ready to be played straight out of the box. You could literally decide to try A Song of Ice and Fire inside your local game store, purchase a starter box, and pop it open right then and there and play your first game with another local player. This would be pretty much unheard of in any Games Workshop game. Now, while you'll still face the miniature gamer's eternal struggle with unpainted plastic, A Song of Ice and Fire does help you along a little bit in this regard. Each faction in A Song of Ice and Fire has its own unique color of plastic, from a burgundy red for Targaryen to a buttery yellow for Baratheon. At the very least, your army will be a different colored plastic from your opponents, assuming they're playing a different faction. Additionally, your movement trays are all uniform and ready to be used straight out of the box with no additional purchase or construction necessary. Reason number 5, the tactics board and NCUs. Perhaps the most unique competitive advantage that A Song of Ice and Fire has over other games in the same genre is its tactics board and non-combat units, or NCUs. The world of A Song of Ice and Fire is, for anyone familiar with the books or the Game of Thrones TV show, a world rich with influential characters of all ages, sexes, and sizes. It makes sense for many of those characters to find their way onto a battlefield and take part in the combat action of the game, but If this game was purely about the combat side of the Game of Thrones, it would leave a great many classic characters out of the fun. In A Song of Ice and Fire, there are non-combat units as well as combat units. These NCUs are individuals rather than blocks of infantry, and represent the characters whose contributions are seen off the battlefield, in the hushed discussions of the small council, or in the secret political machinations of a certain wine-loving dwarf, to give but a couple of examples. It's among the NCUs that you see characters such as Cersei and Tyrion Lannister, Catelyn and Sansa Stark, and even Varys and the prostitute Shae provide their impact on the game. These NCUs work like any other activation, and can be activated on a player's turn just like a combat unit could be. Instead of moving on the battlefield, these NCUs jockey for positions on the game's tactics board. The tactics board is an abstracted space with 5 positions that can be claimed by one player's NCU during their activation. Each of these positions, the crown, the wealth, the tactics, the combat, and the maneuver zones, each provide a different benefit upon being claimed. These benefits vary from providing a free movement to the player's combat unit, to healing a unit, and even providing a unit with a free attack action. A player's control of these various zones could have faction-specific bonuses to that player based on their faction. For example, the Lannisters want to control the crown and the wealth, while the Starks want to control the combat and maneuver zones. The NCUs themselves are not merely blank game pieces shaped in the likeness of well-known characters. Each of them has their own unique abilities that can be often game-changing and are always very much on theme with that character in the source material. Tyrion Lannister, for example, allows his player to have 1 extra card in his hand and to, once per game, draw a card on demand from his player's deck or discard pile that will allow that player to negate the action of their opponent. He definitely embodies the mantra of knowing things. Varys, by contrast, reacts to the tactics board actions of the opponent, punishing them with an effect based on the tactics zone claimed by the opposing player. So he's very much working behind the scenes with his little birds to make things seemingly happen without his direct involvement. These are but a couple of examples of the multitude of NCUs that can be selected by each faction in this game. They all provide unique benefits that have an impact on the game, and A Song of Ice and Fire, the miniatures game, would not be nearly as deep of a game without those NCUs and the tactics board that they fight for control of. Reason number 6, alternating activations. Games Workshop's tentpole games such as 40K and now The Old World feature an outdated I go, you go activation system where one player moves all of their army, attacks with their army, etc. before the opponent gets a chance to move or attack with theirs. Due to this, there are pretty high stakes attached to a single initial initiative dice roll. Most modern game systems, and even some of Games Workshop's own more recent games, feature alternating activations, in which one player activates a unit and the other player activates one of theirs. A Song of Ice and Fire features alternating activations, which keeps both players constantly engaged in what's happening on the table, and adds an extra element of strategy into the proper sequencing of activations. Because A Song of Ice and Fire features non-combat unit activations, the choice of activations in this alternating activation scheme takes on additional strategic depth. Do you want to stall for time on the battlefield and activate one of your NCUs, or do you really need to open the round and charge or attack with one of your combat units? Proper activation control is a hallmark of high-level play in A Song of Ice and Fire, and is a strategic layer that is less significant in games with a multi-phase I go, you go activation system. Leaving aside the strategic considerations, it's just plain boring as a player to stand there while your opponent takes their time doing everything with all of their units. Reason number 7, tactics cards versus magic. Warhammer the Old World has a classic high fantasy magic system in place, such as using fireballs and kind of traditional high fantasy spells. Magic is a metaphysical force that can be manifested seemingly from nowhere to have a devastating impact on the battlefield. A Song of Ice and Fire, taking place in a low fantasy setting, does not have dramatic displays of magical prowess. Instead, I find a good analog in this game to be its tactics cards. In A Song of Ice and Fire, each faction has a distinct set of 14 tactics cards broken out into 2 copies of 7 cards. Once you select a commander for your army, he or she brings along an additional 2 copies of 3 cards specific to them, giving you a deck of 20 tactics cards to draw from throughout the game. You begin the game by drawing 3 cards, and can hang on to those cards, use them during gameplay, or discard them between rounds to draw more cards. Various effects will allow you to draw more cards. These cards allow the players to summon effects to the battlefield that have a similar impact to magical spells in the Old World. These cards will beef up your attacks, they'll make your units more resilient to attack, they will allow you to move out of turn, they can weaken your opponent, or even flat out tell your opponent, no, sorry, you cannot take that action. Tactics cards really are akin to a secret spellbook that each player holds close to their chest. Knowledge of your opponent's deck is crucial at high-level play, so you can be prepared for what they might have up their sleeve. Unlike Old World, where magic is performed during a specific phase of the game, tactics cards in A Song of Ice and Fire are slung from each player's hand when the appropriate card trigger occurs. There are many different card triggers for the tactics cards, so these powerful effects are not confined to one specific phase of the round, and can pop off quite frequently. You'll see instances of players slinging cards back and forth almost like a magic duel from a Harry Potter movie. In fact, I've performed a charge on an opponent before and had him throw out a withering sequence of 5 different cards during the attack and during the charge and the attack, pretty much bringing my attacking unit to its knees. This was an extreme case where the opponent had all the right cards and I tripped over all the wrong triggers that he needed to play those cards, but you can see how tactics cards can be used in a fast and furious manner. Reason number 8, free companion app. A Song of Ice and Fire has its own free companion army builder app called War Council. War Council has existed for almost as long as the game itself, and is a fantastic free resource for all players. The app lets you keep track of your collection of A Song of Ice and Fire miniatures, and most importantly, create and save army lists in an easy and intuitive way. When the game receives seasonal updates, the War Council app is always updated at the same time to reflect unit and tactics card changes. Often when playing games at the local game store, you'll see players not even bother bringing unit cards with them to a game, since they can just reference their unit stats directly from the app. This drastically reduces the amount of setup time and table space that's taken up by laying out unit cards. I personally prefer to have everything in front of me for easy reference, but the more technologically minded players out there enjoy having everything in the palm of their hands. Reason number 9, overall cost. Now, this is going to be a big one. So the cost of playing Warhammer games is one of the primary reasons I have avoided getting into them. Looking at Warhammer the Old World, the MSRP for each of the starting factions is currently $255. On top of that amount, you're going to need to buy more unit boxes to have a full army. So that $255 could easily double to $500 if you want an army with a decent set of unit options. This is of course assuming you can find the boxes you need in stock anywhere. Song of Ice and Fire's faction starter boxes all have an MSRP of $99, and they include everything you need to start playing the game, including the units, rulebook, cardboard terrain and tokens, and a set of faction dice. In fact, most starter boxes have enough units in them that you may only need to buy 1 or 2 more unit boxes to have a pretty competitive army. With each unit box having an MSRP of $40, you can play a competitive 40-point Song of Ice and Fire game minutes after purchase at your local game store for under $200, which is less than one of the Old World starter boxes. Also, as discussed before, each unit box comes with pre-assembled miniatures, a movement tray and unit card, so you have everything you need in the box itself. In A Song of Ice and Fire, you can very easily own multiple armies for the cost of one army in Warhammer the Old World, or any other Warhammer game for that matter. Another perk of A Song of Ice and Fire is pre-assembled miniatures, aside from the obvious perk that they are pre-assembled, is that the unit box's packaging is contoured to fit each miniature. So when you're not actively playing with the miniatures, you can pack them all back safely into their box and stack them on the shelf. You won't need to stare at cabinets and shelves full of loose gray plastic if you don't want to. But this easy storage and stackability has its own drawback, of course. Reason number 10, the future is bright. A Song of Ice and Fire launched in 2018 after a very successful Kickstarter campaign. Since 2018, it has received consistent support, with additional factions being added each year and a steady flow of unit boxes. On top of product support, the game receives regular developer updates roughly every 6 months that keep the meta fresh and keep the game very well balanced compared to its peers. As of the publication of this video, a GameFound campaign for a skirmish-sized cousin to A Song of Ice and Fire, the Tabletop Miniatures Game, called A Song of Ice and Fire Tactics, recently concluded. This skirmish game is being produced with miniatures that are compatible with the Tabletop Miniatures Game, so very soon we will be able to integrate characters from Tactics into the Miniatures Game. Most interestingly, the Tabletop Miniatures Game has until now been confined to the period following the death of King Robert Baratheon, called the War of the Five Kings. Once the miniatures from Tactics are integrated into the game, whole new eras from A Song of Ice and Fire lore will be opened up for exploration in the Tabletop Miniatures Game. This kind of cross-game support ensures that developer attention will not be solely dedicated to the new game, but that content will continue to flow to the Tabletop Miniatures game. There are also confirmed new units in the release cycle this year, with rumors of even more new factions on the horizon. So needless to say, the future of A Song of Ice and Fire, the Tabletop Miniatures game, is looking bright. Now that we've concluded our top 10, I want to provide some resources for anyone interested in exploring A Song of Ice and Fire further. As a first step, I recommend checking out Scott the Miniac's recent fantastic battle report for A Song of Ice and Fire. His video is both a battle report and a learn to play video, and it explains the game in a coherent and very entertaining way. I'll include a link to the video in the description. And after watching Scott's video, if you're looking for more Song of Ice and Fire battle report content, look no further than my channel. Before we close, I would be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to the amazing content creators in the A Song of Ice and Fire community. I'll give links to these channels in the description, and this is by no means an exhaustive list and only covers the main consistent channels that I'm aware of in the English language. Song of Ice and Fire has many thriving communities around the globe. If this video has at all made you interested in the game, please check out these channels and give them a sub. They're all producing stellar content for A Song of Ice and Fire. If I have left any channels out from my list, it is not intentional, and I hope folks will mention other content creators in the comments. Thanks everyone for joining us, and if you've liked the video, please give it a like, comment below, and consider subscribing to the channel. Until next time, this is Randall, signing off.